I'd always thought my life with Emily was a steady, unshakable thing, built on years of shared mornings, quiet evenings, and the kind of trust you don't question because it's as familiar as your own heartbeat. We'd been married for 12 years, a stretch of time that felt both endless and fleeting, depending on the day. She was a nurse, her hands steady and sure, her laugh a bright thing that could cut through any gloom. I worked as a carpenter, shaping wood into furniture that filled our home with warmth. Our daughter, Lily, was 9, a whirlwind of energy with Emily's eyes and my stubborn streak. We lived in a small house just outside Portland, surrounded by pines and the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world's troubles can't touch you. But something had shifted lately, subtle as a crack in a beam you don't notice until it splinters. Emily started staying late at the hospital, her shifts stretching into the night. She'd come home with tired smiles, her hair still pulled back in that tight bun, smelling faintly of antiseptic and something else, something I couldn't place. I didn't ask questions at first. She'd always been dedicated, the kind of woman who'd sit with a patient long after her shift ended just to make sure they weren't alone. I admired that about her, loved it even. So when she said, extra hours or new staff shortages, I nodded, kissed her forehead, and let it go. It was the little things that started piling up, though, things I couldn't unsee once I noticed them. A new perfume, sharp and floral, that she'd never worn before. The way her phone buzzed more often, and how she'd tilt the screen away from me when she checked it. Once, I caught her smiling at a message, a quick, private curve of her lips that vanished when she saw me watching. Just a friend from work, she'd said, tucking the phone into her pocket. I believed her because I wanted to, because doubting her felt like doubting the foundation of everything I'd built my life around. Lily noticed it too in her own way. Mom's always tired, she'd say, her crayons pausing over a half-finished drawing of our family. She doesn't read to me anymore. I'd brush it off, tell her Mom was just busy helping people get better. But the truth was, I felt it too. Emily slipping away, inch by inch like water through cupped hands. I started paying attention, cataloging the late nights, the vague excuses, the way she'd linger in the shower as if washing something off that I couldn't see. It wasn't suspicion yet, just a quiet hum of unease, a splinter under my skin I couldn't dig out. One evening, I came home early from a job, the client having canceled last minute. The house was dark, Lily at a sleepover, and Emily's car wasn't in the driveway. She told me she was working a double shift. I called the hospital just to check in, maybe bring her coffee. The receptionist's voice was cheerful, clipped. Emily? Oh, she's not on tonight. Must have gotten her schedule mixed up. The phone felt heavy in my hand as I hung up, the silence of the house pressing in. I sat there, staring at the kitchen table I'd made for us, its edges worn smooth from years of meals and laughter. Where was she? The question gnawed at me, sharp and insistent, and I knew then that whatever came next, I couldn't let it go unanswered. The next morning, Emily was back, moving through the kitchen like nothing had changed. She hummed as she scrambled eggs, her hair loose around her shoulders, the new perfume clinging to her like a second skin. I watched her, my coffee cooling in my hands, trying to reconcile the woman in front of me with the one who'd lied the night before. How was your shift? I asked, keeping my voice even. She didn't falter, didn't miss a beat. Exhausting, she said, sliding a plate toward me. We had a new patient come in late, kept me on my toes. Her eyes met mine, steady and clear, and for a moment I almost believed her. Almost. But the seed was planted, and it grew fast, twisting roots through every quiet moment. I started watching her more closely. Her habits, her routines, the way she'd slip out of the room to take calls, her voice dropping to a murmur I couldn't catch. I didn't confront her, not yet. I needed proof, something solid to hold on to before I tore open the life we'd built. So I waited, and I watched, and I started piecing things together like I would a broken chair, looking for the joints that didn't fit. It was a week later when I found the first real clue. Emily had left her phone on the counter while she showered, the screen lighting up with a text. I shouldn't have looked. I knew it even as my hand reached for it, but the pull was too strong. The message was from someone named Chris. No last name, just a single line. Missed you last night. Same time tomorrow. My stomach turned. A slow, cold roll that left me dizzy. I scrolled up, just a little, enough to see a string of messages, brief, casual, but intimate in a way that made my chest tighten. Can't wait to see you. You looked amazing. Delete this after. That last one hit hardest. A quiet command that told me whoever this Chris was, he knew she was hiding something. I put the phone back before she came out, my hands shaking as I gripped the edge of the counter. When she emerged, towel around her shoulders, she smiled at me like nothing was wrong. You okay? She asked, tilting her head. You look pale. I nodded, muttered something about a long day, and watched her move through the evening. Cooking, laughing with Lily, brushing a kiss across my cheek before bed. It was all so normal, so perfect, and yet every second of it felt like a lie pressing against my ribs. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay there, her breathing soft beside me, and planned. I'd follow her tomorrow, see where she went, who this Chris was. I didn't want to believe it, didn't want to think she'd unravel us like this. But the evidence was stacking up, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I thought about Lily, about the life we'd promised her, and something hard settled in me. If Emily was stepping outside our vows, I'd find out. And if she was, I'd make sure she felt the weight of it. The next day dragged, every hour a slow grind as I waited for evening. Emily kissed me goodbye that morning, her lips warm against mine, and said she'd be late again. Another double shift. I nodded, smiled, and let her go. The lie hanging between us like a thread I was about to snap. I dropped Lily off at her friend's house, made up some excuse about a late job, and came home to wait. When her car pulled out of the driveway at 6, I was ready, keys in hand, truck parked down the street so she wouldn't see me follow. She didn't head toward the hospital. Instead, she drove west, out of town, the taillights of her sedan weaving through traffic as I trailed a few cars back. My hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white, my mind racing with possibilities I didn't want to name. The city gave way to suburbs, then to a quiet stretch of road lined with motels and gas stations. She pulled into one, a low, faded building called the Pineview Inn, its neon sign flickering in the dusk. I parked across the street, watching as she stepped out, her coat pulled tight around her, and disappeared into room 12. I sat there, engine idling, the air in the truck growing thick with my own breath. Part of me wanted to storm in, kick the door down, see the truth for myself. But I needed more. I needed to know who and why and how far this went. Minutes ticked by, each one heavier than the last, until a black SUV rolled into the lot. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, his hair dark and neatly trimmed. He moved with a confidence that made my jaw clench, heading straight for room 12. The door opened before he knocked, and I caught a glimpse of Emily's face, smiling, before they vanished inside. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone, snapping pictures, his car, the license plate, the room number. It wasn't enough to just see it. I needed evidence, something to hold on to when the rage boiling in me finally spilled over. I waited an hour, maybe 2, the night deepening around me until they came out. He kissed her, quick, familiar, and she laughed, her head tipping back in a way I hadn't seen in months. They parted, driving off in opposite directions, and I followed him, not her. I wanted to know who he was, this man who'd stepped into my life like he had a right to it. His SUV led me to a house in a nicer part of town. Big windows, manicured lawn, the kind of place that screamed money. I parked a block away, watching as he went inside, lights flicking on behind curtains. I didn't know his name yet, but I'd find out. I'd learn everything about him, where he worked, what he did, how he'd met her. And then I'd decide what came next. The drive home was a blur, my mind churning with images I couldn't shake. Her smile, his hands, the door closing behind them. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I wasn't the same man I'd been that morning. Something had broken, and I wasn't sure I wanted to fix it. The next day, I called in sick, something I hadn't done in years, and started digging. The license plate gave me a name, Christopher Hargrove. A quick search online filled in the rest. He was a surgeon at Emily's hospital, 42, divorced, no kids. His profile was polished, LinkedIn headshots, articles about his work in trauma care, even a charity gala photo where he stood in a tuxedo, grinning like he owned the world. I stared at that picture too long, memorizing the lines of his face, the smug tilt of his mouth. This was the man who'd walked into my marriage like it was a room he could rent. I cross-checked his schedule with Emily's, pulling up old texts she'd sent me about her shifts, matching dates with the late nights she'd claimed to be working. The pattern was clear. He was on call when she was stuck at the hospital, their hours overlapping in a way that wasn't coincidence. I found his address online too, confirming it was the house I'd followed him to. Every detail slotted into place, a puzzle I hadn't wanted to solve, but couldn't stop now that I'd started. I drove by the hospital that afternoon, parked in the lot, and watched the staff come and go. I saw him, Chris, stepping out in scrubs, laughing with a colleague, his stride easy and unhurried. He didn't look like a man carrying a secret, and that made it worse. Emily was in there too somewhere, her shift ending soon. I imagined them brushing past each other in the halls. A glance, a touch, some silent signal I'd never caught. The thought twisted in me, sharp and relentless, until I couldn't sit still anymore. I went home and waited for her, the house too quiet without Lily, who was still at her friend's. When Emily walked in, she looked tired but content, dropping her bag by the door. "Rough day?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "Yeah," she said, kicking off her shoes. "Long surgery with Chris, Dr. Hargrove. He's brilliant, though. Makes it easier." She said his name so casually, like it didn't mean anything, and I nodded, filing it away. She didn't know I knew, didn't see the shift in me. I kept it hidden, letting her talk about her day while I planned my next move. That night, I lay awake again, her body warm beside me, and thought about what I'd do. Confronting her wasn't enough. Words wouldn't undo what I'd seen, what I knew. I wanted her to feel it, the betrayal, the way it was carving me hollow. And Chris, he'd pay too. Not with fists or threats, but something slower, something that would linger. I'd always been good with my hands, building things that lasted. Now I'd build something else, a reckoning they wouldn't see coming. The days blurred into a strange rhythm, playing the husband at home, the quiet observer everywhere else. Emily didn't suspect a thing, her routine unchanged, her lies as smooth as ever. I let her think I was still in the dark, nodding at her excuses, kissing her goodbye each morning while the anger in me grew roots. Lily kept me grounded, her chatter about school and friends a tether to the life I was fighting to hold on to. But even that couldn't stop the plan forming in my mind, piece by careful piece. I started with Chris. I followed him again, not to the motel but to his life. His gym, his favorite coffee shop, the bar he hit with colleagues on Fridays. I learned his habits, the way he moved through the world like it owed him something. I dug deeper online, finding old court records from his divorce. Messy, bitter, with accusations of infidelity he'd dodged. It wasn't hard to see the pattern. He took what he wanted, consequences be damned. That made what I had in mind easier to justify. For Emily, it was different. I didn't tail her anymore. I didn't need to. I knew where she went, who she saw. Instead, I watched her at home, cataloging the moments she thought I wasn't looking. The way she'd linger over her phone, the quick glances she'd throw my way to see if I noticed. I started planting seeds. Small things like mentioning a coworker's cheating spouse, watching her reaction. She'd laugh it off, change the subject, but I saw the flicker in her eyes, the unease she couldn't quite hide. The revenge took shape slowly, deliberate as a blueprint. I wouldn't destroy them outright, that was too simple, too quick. I wanted them to unravel, to feel the ground shift beneath them the way it had for me. For Chris, it'd be his career, his pride, his status, the thing he wore like armor. I'd heard enough hospital gossip to know surgeons lived on reputation, and a whisper in the right ear could start a slow bleed. For Emily, it'd be subtler. Her trust, her peace, the life she thought she could juggle. I'd let her see what it was like to lose control, to have her secrets turn on her. By the end of the week, I had the first step ready. I'd found a burner phone at a gas station, untraceable, and drafted a message. Not to Emily, but to Chris. Something vague, threatening enough to rattle him. I know what you're doing. It ends or everyone finds out. I'd send it soon, let it sit in his mind like a splinter. For Emily, I'd wait, let her feel safe a little longer before I pulled the thread. I wasn't sure how far I'd take it, how cruel I'd let myself be, but I knew one thing. They'd regret crossing me, and they'd never forget what came next. The burner phone sat heavy in my pocket for 2 days, a silent weight I carried through every mundane moment. Pouring cereal for Lily, nodding at Emily's chatter about her day, sanding a table in my workshop. I typed the message to Chris a dozen times, tweaking it until it felt right. Short, sharp, a blade slipped between the ribs. I know about you and her. Stop, or the hospital hears everything. No names, no specifics, just enough to make him sweat, to wonder who was watching. On Thursday night, with Emily asleep beside me, I sent it, the cheap screen glowing in the dark. Then I turned it off, hid it in a drawer under old receipts, and waited. Friday morning, I watched her leave for work, her scrubs crisp, her smile as easy as ever. She didn't know what was coming, didn't feel the shift in the air. I dropped Lily at school, then drove to the hospital lot, parking where I could see the staff entrance. Chris emerged around noon, his face tighter than usual, his phone in hand as he paced near his SUV. He kept glancing at the screen, scrolling, then shoving it into his pocket like it burned him. I smiled to myself, a cold, quiet thing. It had landed. He was rattled. Good. I didn't stop there. That afternoon, I called the hospital from a payphone. Rare these days, but still lurking outside gas stations. I asked for HR, kept my voice low, anonymous. You should look into Dr. Hargrove, I said. He's getting too close with a nurse. People are talking. The woman on the other end sounded bored, promised to pass it along. But that was enough. A seed planted, a rumor waiting to sprout. Hospitals thrived on gossip. Emily had said it herself 100 times, and Chris's reputation wouldn't take much to bruise. When Emily came home that night, she was quieter than usual, her movements distracted. Rough day? I asked, stirring pasta on the stove. She nodded, rubbing her neck. Just busy. Chris was in a mood. Snapped at everyone during rounds. I kept my face neutral, but inside, I felt the first spark of satisfaction. He was cracking already, and she was caught in the ripple. I let her talk, dropping vague comments about trust and loyalty, watching her shift in her seat. She didn't suspect me. Not yet. But I could see the unease creeping in, a shadow she couldn't name. That night, I checked the burner. No reply from Chris, but I hadn't expected one. He'd be too busy scrambling, trying to figure out who knew, how much they had. I pictured him pacing that big house, his confidence fraying, and it fueled me. This was just the beginning, small cuts, testing the waters. I'd build on it, layer by layer, until they both felt the weight of what they'd done. Over the next few days, I kept the pressure subtle but steady. I sent another message from the burner. You didn't listen. Next step's your career. Short, direct, a warning he couldn't ignore. I watched him again. Parked near his gym that weekend, saw him check his phone mid-workout, his jaw tightening as he read it. He didn't linger long after that, heading straight home instead of his usual bar stop. I liked that, seeing him shrink, his routines disrupted. It wasn't enough yet, but it was a start. At home, I turned my focus to Emily. I started leaving hints, nothing obvious, just enough to unsettle her. I'd ask about her shifts with Chris, casual but pointed. He's brilliant, huh? Must be nice working so close. She'd laugh it off, but her eyes darted away, her answers shorter each time. Once, I left my laptop open to an article about workplace affairs, the screen glowing when she walked by. She paused, then kept moving, but I saw her shoulders tense. I wanted her to wonder, to feel me circling without knowing why. Lily was my anchor through it all. She'd ramble about her day, her drawings piling up on the fridge, and I'd listen, forcing myself to stay present. But even she felt the strain. Why's Mom so jumpy? she asked one night, her fork hovering over her plate. I brushed it off. Work's tough, kiddo. But it stung, knowing I was part of it now, pulling strings that touched her too. I told myself it was for us, for the family they'd fractured, but the line was blurring, and I wasn't sure where it'd end. I dug deeper into Chris online, finding cracks I could widen. An old colleague had posted about him years back. Vague complaints about arrogance, cutting corners. I made an anonymous account on a medical forum, dropped a hint. Heard Hargrove's sloppy with boundaries. Anyone else? It was a long shot, but if it caught traction, it'd spread. I didn't care if it was true, just that it stuck to him, a stain he couldn't scrub off. By Monday, Emily came home rattled. "Something's up at work," she said, peeling off her coat. "People are whispering about Chris, stupid rumors. He's furious." I nodded, stirring coffee, my pulse steady. Rumors happen. He'll shake it off. But I knew he wouldn't, not if I kept pushing. She didn't mention the motel, didn't hint at their secret, but I saw it in her, the strain, the cracks forming. I'd lit the fuse, and now I'd watch it burn. The rumors took root faster than I'd hoped. By midweek, Emily was venting over dinner, her fork tapping the table. "It's ridiculous. Someone saying Chris got too friendly with a patient's family. HR's sniffing around now." She shook her head, oblivious to the irony. "He's losing it, snapping at everyone." I listened, my face a mask of concern, while inside I felt the gears turning. The HR call had landed, the forum post had spread. Small sparks, but they were catching. I kept tabs on Chris too. I drove by his house late one night, saw him through the window, pacing with a drink in hand. His SUV was gone the next day. Parked at the hospital, then a bar, then back home, erratic as a trapped animal. I sent another message. "They're watching you now. Told you to stop." No response, but I didn't need one. He was fraying, and I could feel it, the control slipping from his hands. Emily started pulling away, not physically, but in the quiet spaces. She'd linger in the shower, her phone glued to her side, her laughs forced when Lily tugged at her. I upped the game at home, left a motel receipt on the counter, one I'd forged with Pineview's logo, dated from a night she'd been working late. She found it while I was in the garage, her voice sharp when she called me in. "What's this?" she asked, holding it up. I shrugged, calm as stone. "Must have grabbed it somewhere. Why's it matter?" She faltered, mumbled something about clutter, and tossed it. But her hands shook, and I knew I'd hit a nerve. I wasn't done with Chris. I printed flyers, simple, anonymous, with his photo and a line. "Ask Dr. Hargrove about his late nights." I left them under wipers in the hospital lot, scattered a few near his gym. Petty, maybe, but effective. By Friday, Emily was a mess, her voice tight as she told me. Chris got called into a meeting. They're questioning his conduct. He thinks someone's out to get him. I nodded, pouring her tea. "Sounds rough. Hope he's okay." The lie tasted bitter, but the satisfaction outweighed it. That night, I lay awake, plotting the next move. Chris's career was teetering, time to push harder. Emily was jumpy, her guilt simmering. I keep them off balance, let the pressure build until they turned on each other. The revenge was taking shape, and I wasn't stopping now. The weekend brought a storm, literal and otherwise. Rain battered the roof as I watched Emily unravel. She'd stopped talking about Chris, but her silence screamed louder than words. Her phone buzzed constantly, and she'd snatch it up, stepping outside to answer, her voice lost in the downpour. I didn't need to hear it. I knew who it was, what they were scrambling to hold together. The flyers had spread. I'd seen one crumpled in a hospital trash can when I picked up Lily from a playdate nearby. The whispers were growing, and Chris was bleeding control. I pushed him further. I mailed a letter to his house, typed no signature, listing dates and times I'd seen him at the motel, paired with Emily's shifts. "Your wife knew how to leave you," I wrote, a nod to his divorce. "Maybe this one will too." Cruel, yes, but I wanted him paranoid, looking over his shoulder. I dropped it in a box across town, gloved hands, no trace. Then I waited, imagining him tearing it open. his smug face paling as the words sank in. Emily cracked first. Sunday night, she came home soaked, her eyes red, her excuse flimsy. A patient's family kept me late. I didn't buy it, didn't care. I left the burner on the table when she showered, the screen blank but its presence loud. She froze when she saw it, her towel slipping. "Whose is this?" she asked, voice sharp. "Found it in the truck." I lied. "Thought it was yours." She stared, then shook her head, but the doubt was there, burrowing in. I wanted her to wonder if I knew, if I'd been the one texting Chris. Monday, I heard from a buddy at the hospital. Chris had been suspended pending an investigation. Conduct unbecoming, they called it. Emily didn't mention it, but her hands trembled as she cooked, her smiles brittle. I kept the pressure on. Asked about him casually, watched her stumble over lies. "He's fine," she said, too quick. "Just stressed." I nodded, letting the silence stretch, knowing she felt it closing in. By Tuesday, they were both breaking. Chris holed up at home, Emily jumping at shadows. I'd built the trap, and now I'd spring it. They'd betrayed me together. They'd fall apart the same way. Wednesday morning, I made my move. I called Emily from the burner, disguised my voice with a towel over the receiver. "He's done," I rasped. "You're next unless you end it." She gasped, the line crackling before she hung up. I pictured her pacing, clutching her phone, the walls she'd built crumbling. She didn't come home on time, texted about an emergency, but I knew better. She was with him, scrambling to salvage what was left. I drove to Chris's house that night, parked a block away. His SUV was there, her sedan beside it. Lights blazed inside, shadows moving, arguing, maybe, or planning. I didn't care. I'd brought the final piece. A USB drive loaded with photos, motel shots, timestamps, even a blurry clip from my truck's dash cam. I mailed it to the hospital board, anonymous, with a note, "Check your surgeon's priorities." It had hit them by morning, sealing his fate. When Emily stumbled in at midnight, she looked hollow, her coat dripping. "Bad night," she muttered, avoiding my eyes. I didn't push, just watched, letting her stew. Thursday, the hospital called her in early. She left pale, her hands unsteady. I knew why. Chris's suspension had gone public, a local blog picking it up. Surgeon under fire for alleged misconduct. The USB would have landed too, hard evidence they couldn't ignore. He was finished, and she knew it tied back to her. That evening, she broke. "Someone's after us," she whispered, staring at her untouched dinner. "Chris got threats, photos. Someone knows." Her voice cracked, her eyes searching mine for answers I wouldn't give. "Who'd do this?" she asked, desperate. I shrugged, calm as ever. "People find out secrets eventually." She flinched, and I saw it. The guilt, the fear, the realization she'd lost control. I'd torn them down. His career in ashes, her peace shredded. But I wasn't done. The real revenge, the cruelest cut, was still coming. They'd feel it soon, and I'd watch it burn them to the ground. The air in our house thickened after that night, heavy with unspoken things. Emily barely slept, her side of the bed cold when I woke, her silhouette pacing the kitchen in the dark. She'd stopped pretending everything was fine, her excuses replaced by silence, her eyes darting to me like I might strike. I kept my mask on, steady and quiet, letting her drown in the mess she'd made. Lily felt it too, retreating to her room with her crayons, her small voice asking, "Is Mom okay?" I'd hug her, say, "She's just tired." But the lie sat bitter on my tongue. This wasn't just tiredness, it was collapse. Friday morning, she didn't go to work. She sat at the table, coffee untouched, her hands twisting in her lap. I watched from the doorway, waiting. Finally, she spoke, her voice low, cracked. "I need to tell you something." My pulse kicked up, but I stayed still, nodding for her to go on. She took a breath, eyes fixed on the table. "I've been seeing someone, Chris. It started months ago. I didn't mean for it to." She stopped, swallowing hard, then looked at me, tears brimming. "I'm so sorry." I let the words hang there, sharp and heavy, cutting through the life I'd thought we had. Part of me had known it was coming, had seen it in every late night, every lie, but hearing it still twisted something deep in me. I didn't yell, didn't move. How long? I asked, my voice flat. 6 months, she whispered. It was a mistake. I was going to end it, but then, she faltered, gesturing vaguely, as if the chaos around her explained it. Someone found out. They're ruining him, and I don't know why. I stared at her, the woman I'd built my world around. Now a stranger unraveling in front of me. You don't know why? I repeated, slow, letting the irony sink in. She didn't catch it, didn't see the hand I'd played. What about us? I asked, tilting my head toward Lily's room. What about her? Emily's face crumpled, tears spilling. I didn't want to hurt you. I love you, I do. I just got lost. Her words were a plea, a lifeline she hoped I'd grab. I didn't. I stood, chair scraping the floor, and walked to the sink, staring out at the pines bending in the wind. You should have thought about that before, I said, my back to her. She sobbed, quiet and broken, but I didn't turn. I'd waited for this, her confession, her guilt laid bare, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt raw, hollow, a wound I'd ripped open myself. I left her there, crying into her hands, and went to my workshop. The revenge wasn't over. She'd handed me the truth, and now I'd use it. That afternoon, I called Chris from the burner. No disguise this time. Just my voice, cold and steady. He picked up on the second ring, his tone sharp. Who is this? I didn't answer that. She told me everything, I said. 6 months, motels, lies. You're done at the hospital, suspended, disgraced. And it's not over. Silence stretched. Then he cursed, low and jagged. You're her husband, he said, realization dawning. What do you want? I smiled, though he couldn't see it. You'll find out. Stay away from her or it gets worse. I hung up before he could argue, the power shifting fully to me. He knew who I was now. Knew I'd been the one pulling strings, toppling his life. Emily's confession had given me the leverage I needed, a weapon sharper than rumors or photos. I spent the day in my workshop, sanding a chair, letting the rhythm steady me. She stayed inside, a ghost moving through the house, avoiding me. Lily was at a friend's, spared the tension for now, but I knew I'd have to face her soon, explain why her world was cracking. That night, I sat Emily down again. She looked drained, her eyes swollen, her defiance gone. What happens now? She asked, voice small. I leaned back, studying her. You're going to call him. End it. On speaker, so I hear. Her mouth opened, then closed, a flicker of resistance dying fast. She nodded, pulling out her phone with trembling hands. I watched as she dialed, Chris's voice crackling through when he answered. Em? You okay? She glanced at me, then spoke, her words halting. It's over, Chris. I told him. We're done. He started to protest. What? You can't just... But I cut in, leaning close. She can. And you'll listen or I send everything, texts, photos, dates, to your ex-wife, your colleagues, the press. You're already sinking. Don't make me bury you. He went quiet, then muttered, Fine. Before the line went dead, Emily dropped the phone, sobbing again, but I felt nothing. Just the cold satisfaction of a knot tightening. I had them both now, cornered and broken. But it wasn't enough. I wanted her to feel the betrayal's full weight, to live with it like I did. The next step was forming, crueler than anything yet, and I let it simmer as she cried. Saturday, I escalated. Chris's career was already gutted, but I wanted his name stained beyond repair. I'd kept copies of everything. Motel photos, texts Emily hadn't deleted, even a voice memo from her confessing to a coworker months back, recorded when I'd borrowed her phone. I compiled it into a file, anonymous but damning, and emailed it to a local reporter I'd found online. Someone hungry for a scandal. Prominent surgeon's affair exposed. I titled it, Letting the Evidence Speak. I sent it from a library computer, no trace back to me. By Sunday, it hit. The story broke online, small at first, a blog post, but it spread fast. Dr. Christopher Hargrove, once a rising star, faces allegations of an affair with a married nurse, backed by photos and messages. His name trended locally, comments piling up, disgust, speculation, calls for his license to be revoked. I watched it unfold from my phone, Lily napping beside me, Emily shut in our room. She didn't know I'd done it, not yet, but she'd feel it soon. Monday morning, she left for work, her face pale, her steps unsteady. She came back hours later, slamming the door. "It's everywhere," she said, voice shaking. "The hospital's a circus, reporters, staff staring. They're investigating me now too." She looked at me wild-eyed. "Did you do this?" I met her gaze calm. "Why would I?" The lie was smooth, and she wavered, doubt clouding her anger. "Someone hates us," she whispered, sinking into a chair. "I've lost everything." She hadn't, not yet. Her job was shaky, her reputation bruised, but she still had this house, Lily, me. I take that too in time. For now, I let her stew, the public shame sinking in. Chris was worse off, his phone off, his house dark when I drove by. The story had legs, and I'd made sure it'd run until he was a pariah. Emily's tears didn't move me anymore. They fueled me. She'd chosen this, and now she'd live it. The fallout bled into our home, slow and relentless. Emily's shifts dwindled. Hospital gossip turned to formal warnings, her colleagues icing her out. She'd come back silent, her scrubs wrinkled, her eyes hollow. Lily noticed, clinging to me more, her questions sharper. "Why's Mom sad all the time?" I dodge, "Grown-up stuff, kiddo." But the truth loomed, a shadow I couldn't hide forever. I hated that she was collateral, caught in the wreckage, but Emily had forced my hand. I kept pushing. I left the article open on my laptop. Let Emily find it one night. She froze, scrolling, then slammed it shut. "You saw this," she said, accusatory. I nodded, leaning back. Hard to miss. Everyone's talking. She flinched, pacing. "They're lying, exaggerating." It wasn't like that. I raised a brow. "Wasn't it? 6 months, motels, him? Sounds right to me." She stopped, staring, then stormed out, the door rattling behind her. I didn't follow. Let her run. She'd come back, tethered by Lily, by guilt. Chris vanished, quit the hospital, sold his SUV, his house listed online. I'd broken him, scattered the pieces. But Emily was still here, clinging to what was left. I started the final phase, stripping that away. I met with a lawyer quietly, drafted papers, divorce, custody, the house in my name since I'd built it. I didn't file yet, just held them, a blade ready to drop. I wanted her to see it coming, to feel the ground give way. One night, she tried to mend things, her hand on mine, voice soft. "Can we fix this? For Lily." I pulled back, cold. "You fixed it when you chose him. We're past that." Her face fell, and I saw the moment hope died. Good. She'd live with the ruin, and I'd make sure it lasted. A week later, I laid it all out. Lily was at her grandparents', Emily's parents, who'd heard whispers and stopped calling her. She sat across from me, defeated, when I slid the papers over. "Divorce," I said, tapping them. "Full custody. You can keep your car, your clothes. That's it." Her eyes widened, then narrowed. "You can't take her from me," she rasped. "I can," I said. "You've got no job soon, no stability. Courts don't care about tears." She read the terms, hands shaking. Alimony denied, house mine, her life gutted. "Why?" she whispered. I leaned in, voice low. "You betrayed me, lied for months, chose him over us. I watched you laugh with him, saw the texts, the motel. I tore him down, yeah, his career, his name. Now it's you. You don't get to walk away clean." Her breath hitched, realization sinking in. "It was you, the threats, the article." I didn't deny it, just watched her break. She signed, tears staining the ink, and I felt it, closure, cold and final. She'd move out, scrape by, carry the shame. Chris was a ghost now, and I'd rebuild with Lily, piece by piece. The revenge was done, cruel and complete, and I'd sleep knowing they'd never forget.